Oh, hi. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our annual webinar. Today, we'll focus on updates and enhancements to our compensation surveys, and we're pleased to have our alliance partners from Deloitte Consulting join us on this webinar. They're going to discuss remote work practices and some results from a recent spot survey on that subject. So some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the reporting will be distributed to participants along with the deck of slides. If you have any questions during this webinar for any of the speakers, you can ask the question in the chat box. And we will also allocate some time at the end for Q&A. And you can also email us at any time, and we're happy to set up a call to discuss one-on-one. So hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Feinstein. I'm Managing Director at Empsight. I'm joined today by my colleague, Susan Bell from Empsight, as well as Julie Yusupov, who is answering all the questions behind the scenes. And we're joined by our guest speakers, Ian Dawson and Sandy Shurin from Deloitte Consulting. Our agenda for today is as follows. First, we'll speak about Empsight and the participant profile of our compensation surveys. Next, we'll speak about what's new and key initiatives, including new level guides for the law department survey. We'll review what's new for 2021 in terms of job families and job levels added. And next, we'll review the upcoming calendar and key submission dates and answer any questions you may have. Finally, I'll turn the presentation over to Ian and Sandy from Deloitte, who will speak about remote work practices and results from a recent survey we did on that topic. So I can see from the attendees today that it's a mix of many of you are new to Empsight and many of you are existing participants. So here's just a little bit about us. So Empsight was founded in 2003 and we're based in New York. We're a leading provider of specialized compensation data for Fortune 500 and large multinational companies. And we also focus on providing data on trending hot jobs. So in 2021, we plan to publish 17 compensation surveys and practices surveys with more than 300 large company participants across all of our surveys. We publish both functional and industry surveys, ad hoc pulse surveys, merit planning, and we also conduct a number of custom surveys for clients throughout the year. Empsight collaborates with a number of organizations, including Deloitte Consulting, who has been an alliance partner since 2014. We're working with Deloitte on a number of initiatives right now, including 2 healthcare compensation surveys and a number of policies and practices surveys, as well as some upcoming speaking engagements. We also work with market pricing platforms to simplify the process for our clients of matching to surveys and receiving survey results within their platforms of choice. We also published 3 editions of our law department survey with our partner, the Association of Corporate Counsel, and we'll discuss the law survey in greater detail on later slides. So our survey participation continues to grow even last year. Our findings are frequently quoted in the HR press and the legal press, including SHRM and World at Work, and as well as like legal publications such as the ACC docket. 211 companies participated in Empsight's core functional surveys last year, representing 15 industry groups with a median revenue of $15.2 billion. We reported 1,143 jobs in 2020, which is actually a 3.6% increase over the previous year. And we reported 238,000 incumbents, which is a 7% increase over the prior year. This slide provides an overview of our functional compensation surveys for 2021, showing the year the survey was started, the average participant revenue size, the number of incumbents, the number of jobs reported, and the price. As you can see, we offer surveys in law, finance and compliance, government relations, corporate communications, IT and security, digital marketing, executive admin support, HR, hot jobs, executive, and operations, supply chain, and logistics. The majority of our large company participants participate in our survey suite, which is called The Works, and you see it up top. That includes all the surveys you see on your screen for about the price of 2 surveys. We started with a lot of companies participating in individual surveys, and it's changed that most companies participate in the suite over the years. In addition to the functional surveys, we're publishing 4 industry compensation surveys this year, including a New York City healthcare provider survey, the Texas Medical Center Compensation Survey, which is a survey of the hospitals in Houston, the credit card and payments industry survey, and finally, an insurance industry supplement, which we started in 2018, and we offer as a module as part of the Works in 2021. We also offer a free policies and practices surveys throughout the year. Our biggest one is the Policies, Practices, and Merit Survey. That one has over 250 participants and reports on merit budget, merit forecast, as well as short and long-term incentive practices. And it's typically published in the summer, and it helps our clients with merit planning. We also offer a free update to this survey in the fall to report on any changes in the merit and incentive forecast for 2021. We also produce a COVID-19 compensation practices survey, as well as a spot survey of remote work practices that we'll speak about later in this webinar. And finally, we plan to publish a law department staffing and organizational practices survey in 2021, which I'll also speak about shortly. This slide summarizes the Empsight survey participation by revenue category, and it gives you a glimpse of our market niche. So the largest category is 30 billion and above. And when you add up the first 2 categories, A and B, nearly 50% of our participants have an annual revenue greater than 15 billion. So the approach we take to defining our job families and levels and role definitions are geared to large, complex multinationals, which makes our data both relevant and extremely reliable for our users. Here's a display of our participants by industry. So the industries with the highest representation are insurance, consumer products, energy, retail, and financial services. And this kind of mirrors what the Fortune 500 is in terms of allocation. For those of you who are new on the call, we want to take a little bit of, talk a little bit about the benefits of participating in Empsight surveys and what distinguishes us from other surveys. So the first benefit is relevant peer groups. Based on the profile and revenue size of the participants that I've just shown, our data can provide a strategic advantage in understanding your peer group, pay practices, and trends. Our survey participants lists are reported by survey, which helps you and your management better understand the context of the data. And our jobs and leveling criteria are consistent with complex organizational structures like your own. The second benefit is standalone job descriptions. So Empsight provides both individual job descriptions and level guide charts to help you match our surveys. So by having standalone job descriptions, it provides you the flexibility to use and modify them when working with your internal management team. And they also import well into market pricing systems and HRIS systems. The third benefit is level guide charts. Empsight's level guide charts were introduced 4 years ago to provide uniform criteria for consistent matching across all of our surveys. Our job descriptions are written to follow these level guides, so they can provide you with a macro perspective when matching across our surveys. Compliance. All of our surveys follow the safe harbor guidelines, which help you avoid antitrust liability exposure. We require a 5-company minimum reporting standard where no company's data exceeds 25% of the sample and the data is older than 3 months. We want to point out that many compensation surveys on the market do not strictly adhere to these guidelines. Hot jobs. Our goal is to be the go-to survey provider for data on emerging, hard-to-find hot jobs. We receive many participant requests for hot jobs, as well as guidance from our survey advisory board. We publish a separate hot job survey and also incorporate many of the hot jobs into our existing survey portfolio. So in this slide, I want to talk about some of the new initiatives for 2021. The first are level guides for attorneys and paralegals, which Susan will review shortly. The second is a law department staffing and organizational structure report to help you benchmark your legal organization against peers. The third is the addition of new supply chain logistic positions that are typically found in distribution center warehousing environments. The fourth is key additions to our hot job survey. And finally, the fifth is a new audit report that you'll receive after you submit your data. So let's start with changes to the law department survey, which is our largest survey and which will be offered in 3 editions in 2021. The large company, the mid-market edition, and the small law department compensation survey. And we have a new alliance with the Association of Corporate Counsel to publish the survey. One of the distinguishing features of this survey is the reporting of legal specialties for attorney and paralegal positions. This year, we've added legal specialties for supply chain manufacturing, as well as research and development. This year, we're also consolidating the number of litigation specialties to 4 to improve the reportability of litigation. For all the other specialties that we offer, such as real estate, regulatory, security, and others, please report them generally for those incumbents who practice them both non-litigation and litigation-based work. Next, we're planning to offer a senior level expert for attorneys, and Susan is going to talk about that in the next slides. And lastly, last year we started collecting global data on law department positions, and we were able to publish an Australian edition of the law survey with the ACC, as well as some data for the UK and Canada. And we hope to expand on global reporting in 2021. So we urge you to match as thoroughly as you can for the legal positions. We actually collect the currency of compensation in the compensation worksheet. So please make sure you report the currency if the data is not US dollar. So actually now I'm going to turn it over to Susan Bell, and she's going to speak about the new attorney and paralegal level guide charts.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good afternoon, everybody. As Jeremy said, we're going to focus now on the new guide charts. Since attorneys and paralegal jobs have unique characteristics and requirements that are distinct from other professionals, we felt they needed their own unique guide charts. And an easy way to tell which guide chart to use when you're doing your input, you should look at the survey job code. All the attorney job codes will end in L1 through L6, and the paralegal job codes end in U1 through U4. The guide charts are applicable to all attorney jobs, including the corporate attorneys, the IP patent attorneys, and claims litigation trial attorneys found in insurance companies. The attorney guide chart has 6 levels. This slide summarizes the characteristics and qualifications for levels 4, 5, and 6. A number of companies have mentioned to us that they do have dual career tracks for their attorneys. Therefore, we created and added a 6th level in the career progression. We expect this 6th level to be rarely reported or used, and it's really meant to be used to report data on renowned legal experts who are leveled equivalent to the SVP level, and these people typically provide C-suite level counsel. The primary role and focus is technical, however, rather than managerial. And if your organization has only 5 levels of attorneys, it's most likely that you should continue to match at the top level expert counsel level 5, if in fact that is a VP equivalent. Okay, the next chart is to focus on levels 1 through 3. And based on matching patterns, we noticed that most companies actually hire attorneys directly into level 3, the intermediate attorney, because their preference is to have attorneys who have prior law firm experience. Level 1 is less frequently reported, as it's typically a recent law school graduate without significant prior law firm experience. This may also be an incumbent who's working towards bar admittance, whereas for level 2 and above, the attorneys have already been admitted to the bar and possibly even in multiple states. On the next slide, I'd like to review some of the key characteristics and qualifications that will be embedded into the new paralegal guide chart. There are 4 levels in this paraprofessional level guide, and the most highly populated levels reported are levels 2 and 3, which suggests that most in-house law departments prefer hiring paralegals with over 2 years of prior experience. The entry level requires an accredited paralegal degree. Key distinctions between the levels relate to the depth and breadth of knowledge and skill and the degree of complexity involved in the assigned work. Additionally, the levels are distinguished by the degree of supervision, where the entry levels are supervised most closely by attorneys for technical oversight, and senior paralegal staff and management provide oversight on other matters. Level 4 is a lead position reserved for incumbents working in highly complex assignments and provide work direction to lower levels. Now let me turn it back to Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Susan. I'm going to go on to the topic of our new law department staffing and organizational structure report. Many organizations have asked us for such a report that enables them to benchmark their law department's organization structure and staffing practices against peer companies. In fact, we're running a couple of custom surveys on this topic right now, as well as last year. Based on the compensation data and other data that we receive from survey submissions, we put together a report that summarizes frequently requested data. For example, the report will include a frequent job titles report, as well as a frequent reports to job titles report by survey position. We also will summarize staffing levels by survey position for revenue, industry, and department size categories. So you can see, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, how many intermediate attorneys do they have, and revenues 30 billion and above, that kind of thing. We also publish metrics such as attorneys per billion and attorneys per 1,000 employees, and we summarize that overall and by industry. We plan to have the first edition of this report available in April, so please reach out to us if that's of interest. Now I'd like to discuss some additions to the 2021 Operations Supply Chain and Logistics Survey. So the changes are focused on some new positions that we've received requests for in distribution centers and warehouse environments. So some of them include electrical and automation technician, electromechanical technician, automation engineer. We've added a new family of procurement that combines direct and indirect purchasing. So that's with companies that tend to be outside of manufacturing. They may combine procurement. We've added supply chain excellence, third-party logistics, business integration, job family, and finally, supply chain data analytics. And that's similar to a data analyst role we have in other surveys, but it's focused on supply chain. In the hot job survey, we've added jobs in 4 functional areas that are in particularly high demand, partly due to COVID-19 impact. The first area is healthcare jobs in corporate environments, including pharmacist, pharmacy technician, and occupational nurse. The second area is environmental health and safety, including subfamilies of health and safety management, as well as fire protection. The third area is supply chain, and we've added some exempt hourly type jobs as well as management jobs that are in distribution and warehouse roles, such as warehouse picker packer, truck driver, which is a particularly hot job, supply chain analytics that I mentioned before, forklift operator. It's like one of the hottest jobs this year. Finally, in IT jobs, cloud computing jobs are particularly in demand for the AWS, Microsoft Azure, remote desktop jobs, data science jobs, IT and cybersecurity jobs, and finally instructional design jobs, which are jobs that design online course learning. So for those companies that are new to this call, we encourage you to try our hot job survey, which is actually free, and it gives you a good taste of what it's like to participate and receive results for Empsight surveys. So I'd like to briefly now show you the look and feel of the 2021 survey input workbook. So I'm going to switch the screen to this questionnaire. So hopefully everybody can see this. The first tab allows you to navigate between all the different tabs that we offer. The most important tabs to complete are incumbent compensation and the contact and organization tab, and everything else is a reference. So let's start with the contact tab. So this is where you fill out organizational information as well as staffing numbers and merit budget and merit forecast numbers. Okay, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to be happy. We didn't make any changes to any of the columns in our compensation worksheet this year, so you don't need to reprogram any of your templates. We just tried to clean up the look and feel, and the one thing we added was we added a grouping filter that allows you to actually show and hide various columns. And actually, oh, here it is. So if you press this plus sign, it shows all the different incumbent information columns that you fill out when you do the export from your HRIS. But when you're doing matching, you might want to press that plus sign and then the minus sign, and then it hides all those columns, and you can evaluate the matches against the base salary and incentives. So just like a little bit of a time saver. This is the job code and descriptions tab. If you want to see all the new jobs for 2021, you can filter on them in the first column. So I'm going to do that. And then you can see all the new jobs and all the new levels for 2021. We didn't mention every change because sometimes we added like a senior director where it was missing one in a certain level. But you're able to see all the new changes just by doing that filter. And this has all the job descriptions you need. This has basically almost all the information you need to participate in the survey. Here's the job code that you use to match in the incumbent worksheet. The next tab, this is the specialties tab. You only use this tab on the law survey, and this has all the different litigation and the different legal specialties. And you use it for the executive admin survey to show what area that they're in, as well as for some supply chain jobs, but it's mainly for the legal survey. Finally, to the right of all of this are the different level guides that can help you match multiple jobs to multiple job families more quickly. So these are just here as a reference. So here's the professional guide, here's the technical guide, the support level guide. We have one for operations support, and that's about it. We have an executive level guide. So if anyone has any questions while I'm doing any of this, feel free to ask your question in the chat. And if there aren't any questions yet, I'll just move on to the audit report. So we actually have a our data scientists programmed an amazing audit report that we're going to send you after you submit your data this year. And it's intended to improve the accuracy and validity of the data and assist you in improving your matching. So once you submit the data, we're going to send you back this quick report, and we hope it'll improve reportability, accuracy, and relevancy of the survey results. Just a quick reminder regarding your Empsight.com accounts. So multiple users are permitted, and each user can create their own account to view data. So the accounts provide access to 3 years of compensation survey results for your company, as well as the ability to view and pay invoices online. And if you want to add contacts from your company, simply email us with your colleague's email and contact name, and we'll add them to the system. If possible, don't sign up on your own for a new account, because it won't be connected to your company's account. But we can do that on the back end if you do that. Okay, we're always looking for ways to streamline the way you match our surveys and receive results. So therefore, there are 2 ways that you may receive results from Empsight. The first is with the user account on Empsight.com that I just mentioned. And the second is through third-party market pricing systems such as PayScale, MarketPay, PayFactors, Salary.com, Towers Watson. So if you're a new client in any of those systems, we actually send the results directly to them, and you can usually send an invoice to them that shows you participate, and they'll be able to turn on the survey data and give you access to historical data. And I actually just want to do a quick poll to see what market pricing platform everybody is using this year, just so we have a good idea of who to work with and who to provide our templates to. So I'll leave the poll up for a few more seconds. Most people have already voted. Okay, about 5 more seconds. Okay, I'll share the results. So it looked like a lot of companies use MarketPay and PayFactors, and also Salary.com and Willis Towers Watson. Okay, so after a review of the key dates, Ian and Sandy from Deloitte are going to present some content from our remote work survey. So this year's survey questionnaires will be available in the next couple of weeks in very early March. We're almost ready to distribute it. The survey submission due date will be May 31st, and results will be sent out in September 2021. And the survey, we'll verify the data between May and August 2021. So let's see if we have any questions. There's one question here. Okay, does anyone have any additional questions? This was already answered. It was a private question. Okay, yes, one company asked, how do we get more information about the law department's staffing and organizational practices survey? It's a brand new product. We're going to put it on our site, but thank you for asking. We'll email you more information about it. Any other questions right now? We can also have questions at the end. There's not questions right this moment, so I'm actually going to turn it over to Ian and Sandy to talk about remote work practices.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks for the insights on the latest goings on at Empsight. And I want to take the opportunity just to thank Jeremy and Julie and Susan for having us today and for partnering with us on this really interesting survey that we put out into the market last year. Just by way of quick introduction, my name is Ian Dawson. I'm a senior manager with Deloitte. And I've spent the vast majority of my career working in the compensation world. So I talk to companies on a daily basis about all aspects of compensation, from broad-based all-employee compensation all the way up to executive level compensation. And I'm joined by my colleague Sandy Shuren, who's one of our leaders in tax. And Sandy and I have been having lots of conversations about the impact of remote work on mobile workforce, given the increased focus on remote work over the last 12 months in connection with COVID-19. So we're delighted to be here and share with you some of the findings of this survey that we put out into the market late last year. So if we could just flip forward a couple of pages on the presentation, please. Yeah, this is a great place to start. Thank you. So, we got to late last year and we were having lots of conversations out in the market with people around how are companies adjusting pay for their workforce now that they are not necessarily required to be in the office. And, we had some thoughts and ideas about what might be the right thing to do, the right way to treat compensation, but honestly, we didn't have any data. So that's where we partnered with Jeremy and the team to go out and ask a series of questions of companies around what exactly they have done around compensation in connection with having an increased remote workforce. Do they have remote work policies? And if so, how are they structured? And so that's what we want to touch on here today, is just, we're going to summarize a few pages of the results here that we think are particularly interesting. And you'll be able to get access to the full survey results themselves on Empsight's website. And I would encourage you to do that because there's really a lot of rich information, and we're just going to scratch the surface here in our discussion today. So as you might imagine, we got results from over 200 companies, and the vast majority, over 90%, have a remote work policy in place. And that's not a great surprise given the way the world has changed over the last 12 months. For over half of those companies, that doesn't necessarily apply to the entire workforce. And again, that's not a great surprise because, of course, there are many industries where remote work is just not an option. But what I think is most interesting is that almost 50%, you see over there on the right-hand side, 48% of companies don't yet know what their remote work policy is going to look like after we come out of COVID. And I think that's really interesting. And there's a lot of strategic conversations going on out in the market right now. Is what is our go-forward talent strategy going to look like? Are we going to require everyone to come back into the office, or are we comfortable with an increased remote workforce, or are we going to land on some sort of hybrid model? And so companies don't know the answer to that. The vast majority, half of companies don't know the answer to that question right now. And it's a really important topic to be having all the way through the organization, frankly, because this goes up all the way to the C-suite, the CHRO, the CFO, and the CEO on a strategic level, frankly. And just down in the bottom right-hand corner, this is another bit of information that I really wanted to touch on, is less than a third of companies have actually reimbursed remote workers for home office equipment over the last 12 months. And I think that's really interesting, given the need to be at home and to work. Many people don't necessarily have the spaces or the equipment that they need to work effectively and efficiently. And I admit, I expected there to be more being provided to workers for remote work. But less than a third of companies are doing that. And I think that is something we will see expand over the next 6, 12, 18 months, as maybe people settle into remote work a little bit more and say, okay, well, if I'm not using the office space and you're saving on the costs associated with real estate, then maybe some of that gets reallocated to supporting people at home. So it was really interesting to me that not as many people as I had expected were supporting their employees by providing equipment at home.
Just to tag on to that, Ian, I think one of the interesting trends that I'm seeing, just because we're getting a lot of questions around, from a tax perspective, the taxability of what you are reimbursing, the nature of what companies are reimbursing, I think, to me, from what I've seen, has changed certainly over the last 12 months, since I think we saw the onset of work from anywhere, remote work, even from 6 months ago and 3 months ago. And as you're starting to see a greater rollout of vaccine, both in the US and globally, the nature of what is being reimbursed, and I agree with you. I think the home office equipment number seems a bit low, but I wonder, kind of part of this may be a timing issue on what companies are focused on reimbursing, because at this stage in pandemic, there seems to be a growing number of companies reimbursing for things like COVID tests. To the extent you look globally and COVID vaccines are not available for free, I'm seeing an increasing number of organizations offer to reimburse vaccine costs that are incurred by their workforce. So I think part of why that number may seem a little bit low could be a timing of when this was asked, because frankly, from what I saw, there was a pretty big wave in the first 6 months or so of pandemic and work from home, where a lot of organizations leaned in with more infrastructure, hardware, software, kind of general home office equipment, whereas now the nature of what they're reimbursing has shifted. That's a little bit what I'm seeing in the market.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think as companies start to think about what their strategies look like going forward, this is going to be a key component of what that long-term talent strategy looks like. When you think about the overall employee experience of working from home and being in the office, I think this will come to the fore a little bit more than maybe it has done in the past, when people, I think, still even 12 months in, are still in a little bit of reactionary mode, frankly. And as people start looking forward as we come out of this, it may become slightly more prominent.
Yeah, I'll also give one final tax plug kind of on this point, which is if you look domestically and globally, some of the tax ramifications of what you reimburse to your employees are driven by whether or not an emergency order is in place. And so I'm not certainly by any means saying that emergency order will be lifted at any specific time. That's not my place to say. But I do think as those restrictions lift, that starts to impact some of the tax ramifications. Some of the tax conclusions are dependent on whether or not there is an emergency in place. And so as the environment shifts, the tax ramifications of what you provide could shift as well, given we may or may not be in a emergency state any longer.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Andy. If we could just flip forward to the next slide. I thought this was really interesting as well. And it tells me a little bit that, again, companies are still in a kind of reactionary phase and hadn't quite understood the full implications of what remote work actually means in practice. Because what we found was that over 2/3 of companies in their remote work policies do not place any restrictions on where people can work. Only 32% of companies, so about a third, have some sort of guideline on where you can work remotely from. And even then, the information that we were able to gather was pretty sporadic. About 40% just say, okay, you have to work in the same country. And just under a third, 28%, say there's certain jurisdictions that you can't work in. So for the most part, you've got a remote workforce, a significantly increased remote workforce, and they've been given no real guidelines on where they can work from. And I'm sure everyone on this call either has personal experience with themselves and their friends and family, or maybe some colleagues who have taken advantage of the flexibility that remote work affords us to go maybe somewhere warmer, maybe somewhere quieter, who knows. But there's all sorts of implications around where your workforce has been working and the tax and payroll implications. And Sandy will touch on that in a little bit more detail as we get into this discussion. But I did think it was a really interesting finding from this survey that companies really haven't placed those restrictions yet. And I think what we're going to see is that as companies really start to understand a little bit more of the unintended consequences that can go with the remote work policy that doesn't have these sorts of guidelines and restrictions, they're going to have to sit up and say, okay, we're going to need to rethink our remote work policy going forward and put some stronger guidelines and a framework in place on where people can work from, frankly, because it is clearly not something that has been at the forefront of people's minds to date. But I think it will become much more important. If we could move forward, please. So one of the questions we wanted to ask in the connection with an increased remote workforce is, okay, well, do you adjust people's pay if they're no longer working in the same location in which they were hired? So we wanted to understand, do companies have geographic differential policies? And again, I was a little bit surprised. The vast majority of companies do. 70% of companies do use geographic differential policies to adjust base pay based on the location of the individual. And almost 1 in 5 of those companies are saying, actually, we need to take another look at that because we have a much bigger, more geographically dispersed workforce now than we did 12 months ago. So maybe we need to review that and understand, are we using enough different regions, for example, and how does that policy actually apply potentially to people that move? Then of course there's cost implications with geographic differentials. We've certainly heard stories and from clients, and you may have read some in the press, frankly, of maybe some large technology companies in high cost of living areas on the West Coast. They had found instances of employees taking advantage of the remote work and saying, okay, well, look, I don't need to pay rent or mortgage or whatever in a high cost of living area on the West Coast, so I'm going to move to a low cost of living area. And they were actually very aggressive, and they reduced pay to say, okay, well, look, you no longer have that high cost of living because you're not, for example, in the Bay Area. So we're going to adjust your pay down. And of course, it goes the other way as well. You know, there are some people in a lower cost of living area where national averages might be used, and if you're using national averages, that could be too expensive. So there's all sorts of cost implications around where your employees are working from, understanding where they are and what the potential costs are around that. And the one thing I'll add on this before we flip forward to the next page is, you know, there's still a lot of companies that don't have one and aren't considering adopting a geographic differential policy. And I would just encourage companies to think about the cost implications, frankly, and your talent pool and your talent strategy. One example I can share is a company here in the Midwest. I'm in Chicago. Is transitioning to a 100% remote work. They used to have everyone in the office, and their radius for hiring talent was probably 50 or 60 miles around the Chicago area. And they're saying now they've been very successful in transitioning to remote work. And they're saying, you know, there's a lot of money for us to save by maintaining this remote work strategy. And so they've used traditionally national averages to recruit talent, because that's kind of the cost of living roughly for this area. But what the conversation has become is, okay, what are the unintended consequences potentially of using a national average? And the reality is, if you use a national average and now all of a sudden you have this 100% remote workforce, the talent pool that you can go and attract has just expanded from 50 or 60 miles around Chicago to a national talent pool. And are you really going to be able to attract, you know, top talent, top performers from, say, the West Coast or the East Coast, if all you're doing is offering the national average in places where people might expect to earn 15 or 20% more than that because of the cost of living? So again, there's just lots of unintended consequences and lots of nuances around thinking through your geographical pay differential policy. And clearly some companies are doing this, maybe about 1 in 5 are doing it, but there's still a lot of companies that aren't doing that right now. So I think it's something that is particularly interesting, and something I think people should be spending a bit more time thinking about than they have been, honestly.
Oh, Ian, I wanted to interrupt to see if you wanted to do a quick poll on this topic.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if we could, please, Jeremy. Thank you. So is your organization rethinking the use of geographic pay differentials as a result of an increasingly dispersed remote workforce? Like I say, some companies are having this conversation right now, but I think as more of the unintended consequences of a remote workforce and a broader talent strategy conversation come to the fore over the coming months, I think this is going to be, you know, a hot topic.
Okay, great. Just we'll wait a couple more seconds for people to vote. There's nearly 100 companies on this call.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing whether my hypothesis is right.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to publish the results.
All right. So maybe not as many people thinking about it yet, but a fair few, almost half, saying they're not quite sure yet. Again, and that's consistent, honestly, with the conversations we've been having, is people don't quite know what the future holds yet, but it's likely on companies' radar. So that's fairly consistent with, you know, what we've been hearing from our clients as well, Jeremy. Okay. So one more slide I want to touch on before I give the floor to Sandy, just to share some of his insights from the conversations he's been having around the tax implications of remote work. We were interested to understand whether the geographic differential policies that companies have in place would be applied to people who work 100% remote. Now, of course, geographic differential policies that are in place right now were generally put in place on the basis of employees doing office-based work in some of the large high cost of living metropolitan areas across the country. We now find ourselves in a very different situation. So very often those policies weren't designed with this new normal in place. So we wanted to understand whether companies actually would apply geographic differentials to people who are 100% remote. And actually, yes, 70% of companies with geographic differential policies said, yes, if someone is 100% remote, we will look at where they are working from, and we will adjust their pay accordingly. Now that begs the question of, how do you treat people who move? So if someone moves from a high cost of living area to a low cost of living area, are you going to geographic differential their pay down? And the opposite is also true. So again, that's one of those unintended consequences of these sorts of policies that companies need to be aware of when they have a mobile workforce that is working remote, that hasn't been doing so before. And interesting, and you know, most companies are only using 3 to 5 different areas for their pay differentials. I expected this number to be higher, and I expected it to be trending higher, because my theory was that you have a more dispersed workforce, there's more regions to cover, so maybe companies will get a little bit more specific about the number of regions where they differentiate pay for. But actually, we found 3 to 5 was very consistent. And actually, when we asked companies if they were planning on increasing that, they unequivocally said no, 3 to 5 is expected to remain the norm. So that was a little bit surprising for me, but city and metro area probably won't be a big surprise if that's really where the geographic differential is focused. And the last point I want to make here before I hand to Sandy, and hopefully this is a nice little segue, is that most companies are not tracking where their employees are. They're assuming that their employees, if they are working remotely, are working from their home address, and some companies are using the location where the individual is hired to assume that is their location. Very, very few companies, only 4% are proactively tracking or trying to find out where their employees are. And that in itself represents a potentially large tax and payroll risk. That gives me the opportunity to hand you over to Sandy, who can explain a little bit more about some of what he's seen in this area.
Right, and I actually wanted to interrupt again because you actually had a poll on this question as well.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I was getting carried away there, Jeremy. Thank you. So does your organization have a good view on where remote workers have been located over the last 10 to 12 months? So this goes back to the question, or the data point that we gathered was that actually no, most companies are making assumptions on where their employees are, but they don't actually know for sure.
Right.
So
several companies mentioned they use IP address, but that was
it's a little bit Big Brother maybe, but it's maybe it's a sign of the times.
Okay, I think most people have voted, so I'm gonna end the polling and share the results. Yeah,
I mean that's exactly what I would expect, but I think Sandy's going to now tell you why companies might want to take a little bit more of a proactive approach in trying to understand where their employees have actually been. So with that, I think we can flip forward to the next slide, and I'll give Sandy the floor.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, the polling is interesting. I'm sure this sounds super self-serving, but the numbers are actually kind of what I would have expected. And to be honest with you, even at 14% of respondents tracking, that number is a significant uptick from what we saw even in 2020. The tracking of where employees are is a really interesting discussion for tax purposes. One, I think there's the question of how will we do it? This notion of kind of VPN logins and IP tracking, it's not really the most employee-friendly message if it gets out there. It's not really kind of likely to be well received from your workforce. I'm not saying that you wouldn't do it just solely on those grounds, but I've had a lot of my clients tell me that, look, if word were to get out there that this is how we were kind of tracking our employee movement, even with good intentions in terms of being compliant, it's not going to be well received by the workforce. So then the question becomes how. The other part of the equation in terms of tracking where your employees are, whether it's for compliance or whether it's for comp strategy or whether it's for any other reason, is do you have a methodology or do you have a framework to address comp strategy or compliance once you get that data? And I think that's where a lot of issuers that I speak with today are really struggling with. The employers that I work with are saying, even if I could track the data, and even if I found out that Sandy was no longer based in state A, but now is in state B, what payroll functionality do I have to react to that? Or how quickly can I change comp structure and comp packages to react to that? Do I want to react to that? So there's a lot of upfront work that needs to get done. Simply having a data point that employee has moved from state A to state B or country A to country B, we're seeing this kind of on a global basis, is really step 2. Maybe even step 3 or 4 or 5. There really needs to be a lot more diligence done up front in terms of what will I do once I find out that Ian is no longer in Chicago? Am I going to react to that and how? And so that's where I see a lot of employers struggling today, really putting in this framework around what will I do. Now, I'm conscious that we're kind of here at the end of February 2021. As I alluded to earlier, the remote work discussion has shifted significantly over the last 3 months, and it's certainly different today than it was in February of 2020. As organizations, we're still figuring out, can our people even log in at home? Well, now we figured out people can log in at home. Now we figured out people can work at home, but what will the workforce look like? And from a withholding and a reporting perspective and a tax compliance perspective, a lot of organizations are operating what I'm seeing as kind of a 3-bucket model. One is there are people who will be assigned to an office, they'll go to that office. There's still a tremendous amount of labor in this country that needs to be done by hand or with somebody kind of on a shop floor. And those individuals do not have the option to work from home. That job can't be done remotely. Conversely, on the other end of the spectrum, there are jobs, frankly, I'll say I'm fortunate in that I think my job can largely be done remotely. And so there are individuals who may not even be assigned to an office. They'll work entirely remotely. They're not even assigned to a permanent workstation or work office. And then there's the hybrid model, which, to be honest, is probably taking up the bulk of the workforce that's out there, where individuals are assigned to an office. They may come to that office 1, 2, 3, 4 days a week, but they're not expected to be there 5 days a week, nor do they want to be there 5 days a week. And I think that's where the bulk of the population is today. From a compliance perspective, the challenge then resides in terms of saying, okay, well, what are the different compliance obligations with those different buckets, or those different categories of employees? And I will tell you that those individuals assigned to an office, even if they're working from home, could be treated differently than those individuals not assigned to an office and working from home. So I think you need to tackle that. But as I alluded to in the example of Ian potentially leaving Chicago and showing up in Wisconsin, well, that's going to have a payroll implication. And is it as simple as the day he gets there, I shift my earnings code and I pull the lever and turn off Illinois and turn on Wisconsin? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of that is fact sensitive. And I'll tell you that, I have clients that are based all over the country, and a move from California to New York is different than a California to Texas, which is different than a California to Arizona. Those are 3 different scenarios for payroll reporting and withholding purposes. And I'm starting to see, for those of you in the 14% of the bucket that are saying I track my employees, those are the conversations I would hope that you're having to say, okay, we're tracking these people, we know where they're going, but do we know what this means from a payroll perspective? Is it as simple as turn on, turn off, and turn on? And in many cases, it's not, if for no other reason than individuals have bonuses and multi-year comp items that need to be sourced between different jurisdictions. But then you layer on the complexity of reciprocity agreements and reverse credit arrangements, and exemption claims. And once you go global, you have totalization agreements and treaties to work in, and intra-European moves as opposed to, those moves that leave Europe. I mean, all of these scenarios have different payroll ramifications. But I think, step one is to really get your arms around, if we run into these cases, what will we do with them? And then, as I alluded to, get back to the question of, okay, well, how will we track? The tracking, a lot of my clients tell me I'm not going to start tracking my people if I don't have any infrastructure or controls in place to do anything with that data. But I would encourage you, a lot of tax authorities, unsurprisingly, this is on their radar. For some of the higher, if I focus on the US, some of the higher tax states, this is a revenue loss for them, right? If people are leaving New York and California and showing up, I live in Texas, our tax situation is pretty straightforward. It's a 0, and so if people leave California and New York and show up here in Texas, that's a revenue loss in theory for California, but they're not going to give up that fight so easily. They may say, look, some of your income is still allocated to California, or the year that you left, you actually haven't broken residency. You're still resident in California. And so at least for this year, we would expect your income to be fully taxable. Credits for other states, but there's no tax in Texas, so there are no credits. These are all the scenarios that you need to work through. And then I think to that point, there's also an employee education component to this. So again, I would encourage you to look at this. There's no doubt that at the state level and the global level, revenue authorities will be leaning into this, especially those places that are net exporters of talent. For them, this is largely a revenue loss, and a lot of them have a hurting tax base to begin with. And so the fact that the fact that withholding obligations and tax remittance obligations start with the employer, it's often not a defense to just say, look, well, my employee paid the tax, isn't that fine? No, it's often not. It's not a good enough defense. You have an obligation as an employer to withhold correctly in the first place. By the same token, I want to caveat that by saying the regulations in the U.S. at least, and typically globally, don't require you to have a crystal ball. No one's expecting you to know at year end how an employee will file a tax return, resident or non-resident, but they do require some level of reasonableness. And if you're in that 80+% bucket that's saying, I don't even track my employees today, that probably tells me that you also haven't looked at the infrastructure to say, what happens when we start tracking them? What will we do with that data? And I think my fear as more and more organizations tell me that they're not tracking yet, my fear is that if that issue should come under scrutiny, simply saying, well, I had no mechanism to know where my people were, I think that's going to be challenged. Is that reasonable? We are living in a world where we know individuals are not in the office. So how reasonable is it really to just assume everyone's at home? Debatable. But I think you need to have that discussion as an organization and say, is that really what we're going to say if this comes under scrutiny? We just assume everybody is in the same place they were 12 months ago, knowing full well how the world's been operating. I think that presents an increased risk. So I'm not trying to scare anyone into this. I just want you to be aware, kind of, I think, this is what we're seeing. 2021 is when I think we'll start to see an uptick, some of the audit activity around this space, and we'll probably have more case studies around what we're seeing in audit. But I think there was a big bucket of employers who in 2020 effectively kicked this can down the road a little bit. I'm not saying I support this or it's technically defensible, but kind of took 2020 maybe as a bit of a write-off. This is a strange year, a lot of moving pieces. We don't have kind of infrastructure in place. Maybe we'll get a pass. I don't see that same line of reasoning in 2021. We're now in year 2. And I think revenue, if they won't say it for 2020, we'll certainly lean in on 2021 and say, look, you can't just continue to put your head in the sand and assume that everybody's in one place and that place has never changed. We expect you to have some controls in place because I think there is a risk that it would be viewed as unreasonable to assume that nobody's made a move throughout pandemic. So zooming out a little bit, you see on your screen here, we're focused on kind of the top left quadrant of the wheel here. This is a wheel of issues. There are certainly more issues, but as you address remote work, Ian and I like to say, we've had this discussion several times, that at its core, there's a lot of technical issues to work through in remote work. You're seeing here, the infrastructure we talked about, hardware, software, IP. To the extent you're crossing borders, you have immigration issues, you have employment tax, as alluded to, corporate tax, PE issues globally, nexus issues. But if we zoom out from some of the technical, at its core, this is a talent strategy discussion. Where will our people be? How will they work? Where will we recruit? What will our physical footprint look like? How will people support our business? And I think that's where this discussion needs to start. Some of the technical that we've alluded to here around payroll reporting and withholding and the tax issues and some of the other, maybe non-tax issues, those are all components, but I think at its base, at its most fundamental level, organizations need to really zoom out and say, what's our talent strategy? And then do these compliance considerations change that at all? So that's where we are in the market. Ian, I know we've had discussion a lot of times. Anything you wanted to tag on in terms of the talent strategy component?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Sandy. It really is worth zooming out. There's a lot of technical aspects to this, but you can't really address those technical aspects without zooming out and understanding a broader talent strategy going forward.
Yeah, I know we're kind of coming up on the top of the hour here, so I'll just quickly go through. I think there's one more slide here around kind of, I get this question all the time, like, come on, Sandy, how bad could it be? So this is how bad it could be. This is the truth of the matter, kind of as employees start to cross. I was just on a call earlier this afternoon with some of my colleagues who support in our credits and incentives practice, and certain states have offered certain credits and incentives to make sure that your workforce is in a certain place. And if that workforce isn't there, well, that impacts the credits and incentives that you've been given, and you could potentially completely impact your strategy there. As employees move from one state to another, we don't practice law here at Deloitte, but some of the lawyers that I work with are saying, well, you've got different HR policies and different legal standards and that employees need to be made aware of if they're actually working in a different state. So realistically, I don't think it's not an exaggeration to say that just a handful of people kind of working in a different state, especially where you're not a registered employer. But those people going to a different state can really disrupt the business. So I would be kind of cautious. And again, if you're in that big bucket of people not tracking your employees, I would encourage you to kind of have that discussion around what would we do once we start tracking. But I think you'll start to fall out of the majority there, and probably within this year, I think we'll see a substantial shift in the number of companies that are tracking and putting their arms around the compliance.
And we're going to share these slides as well, I think, right, with the participants. So I think I love this slide. I think it's a great conversation starter to have internally, and everyone's free to use that. We do have one more slide. Honestly, most of the content on this slide is fairly self-explanatory. I'm mindful that we're getting to the top of the hour. This slide really just talks about some of the geographical pay differentials between some of the high cost of living areas and the lower cost of living areas, and the workforce that is impacted by that. And I was somewhat surprised to see that the entire workforce normally falls under geographic differentials, not just the rank and file. It goes all the way up to the executives. But I do want to be mindful of time, knowing that we're going to send these slides out. There's nothing particularly revolutionary on this page, so I want to be mindful of time and give Jeremy the floor back just to wrap things up quickly.
Oh, sure. Thanks so much, Ian. By the way, we've had a lot of questions on the chat, and I don't know if everybody can see them, but we can read. We've been trying to answer them during this presentation, but like one question was, this data was from the employer perspective. Is there any data that shows the employee perspective? I work from home. I wonder how much energy consumption and how much money I've spent making space more comfortable. Is there any data out there relating to the employee perspective? Just curious.
Gosh, that's a good question. We actually are spending more and more time going out to clients and engaging with the employees. Our clients are very often heads of HR or heads of rewards. So they're doing a lot of what we call employee sensing to understand how people are reacting to being at home. I haven't seen that publicly available yet. And I definitely haven't seen it with regard to cost of energy consumption, but it would be really interesting survey to see employees' reactions and that balancing act. The short answer is companies are asking their employees what their preferences are in this regard, but I haven't seen the dollars and cents put to that. I would love to see it if someone comes up with it though.
We have 2 more questions. Maybe quickly, let's get
Sure.
back. What comp package changes are being applied if roles become remote location? For instance, for sales employees, should they still get a car to visit the customer?
Well, everything's unique, right? Every question is unique. I don't know why you would take a car away from a sales employee if they're remote. Presumably they still need a car to get to their customers. What we've seen when people move from one location to another or move from the office to remote is we don't ever generally recommend pay cuts. If someone moves to a low cost of living area, we don't necessarily say you should adjust their pay down. We normally say you should red circle that and let the market catch up. It's not generally considered a good motivational tool to cut people's pay. So some consistency and understanding of the broader implications of changing people's pay and rewards is worthwhile.
I will also say, just be careful. I'm sure everyone gets really excited about the tax piece, but I will just quickly kind of plug the tax side of that question, which is a lot of times you'll see tax breaks globally when you provide cars that are used for business purposes. If an individual retains that car and there isn't a specific exemption under COVID, I think there's unless they are still out visiting their clients, and I think that's, to Ian's point, that's a very specific discussion to each company. But if they're specifically using that car at home, or they're somehow doing their sales pitches remotely or working remotely, I think it becomes a challenge to say that car is being used for business purposes, and certainly if it is a challenge to say that, I think you could have a knock-on impact on some of the tax exemptions that are typically provided when a car is used for business purposes.
Thank you. And another question based on the graphic on defining geographic differential areas, which method do you think is best?
Well, I think city and metro area makes most sense for most companies. Most regions or states can have vastly different costs of living, even within the same state or within the same region. So I think specificity up to a point is worthwhile. I think you can normally get that with a city or metro area.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Sorry we ran a little bit over. If anyone else has any questions, you could email us or the Deloitte team.
Please, and thank you again, Jeremy and the Empsight.
Thank you, the panelists.
Yes, thanks so much, everyone, for participating this year in this webinar.
Thanks. Bye.